The headlines make it look sudden, a raid, a capture, a president gone in the night. But nothing about this was sudden. What happened in Venezuela wasn't a decision made in days or weeks. It was the release of pressure that had been building for years across an entire hemisphere. And Venezuela wasn't the target. It was the proof. If this were about one man, one country, or one operation, it would already be over. But it isn't. This was a systems move, and systems don't end when the cameras turn off. They keep moving, quietly, into the next constraint. The media is treating this as a sequence of unrelated crises. Venezuela here, Mexico there, Panama mentioned in passing, Canada pulled into trade disputes like an afterthought. But these aren't separate stories. They're pressure points on the same map. And when pressure appears simultaneously across multiple fronts, it isn't coincidence, it's design. This isn't about ideology. It isn't about democracy. It isn't even primarily about oil. It's about leverage. Who controls trade routes? Who sets payment terms? Who can deny access when compliance fades? The administration calls it national security. Others call it containment. The label doesn't matter. The mechanism does. For years, the strategy relied on incremental pressure, sanctions layered carefully, trade rules tightened selectively, diplomatic isolation when it could be done quietly. But incrementalism only works when time is on your side. And time stopped being neutral a long time ago. What changed is not American intent, it's American tolerance for drift. Across the Western Hemisphere, economic gravity has been shifting away from Washington in ways that don't show up in election cycles. Trade flows have diversified. Infrastructure ownership has changed hands. Payment systems have multiplied. Countries that once depended almost entirely on US approval now have alternatives. Not perfect ones, not cheaper ones, but sufficient ones. Venezuela sat at the center of that shift because it represented the most dangerous precedent, not because of its production, which is degraded, but because of its reserves, and because it was learning how to monetize those reserves outside the dollar system. That alone was enough to turn a slow-burning problem into an intolerable one. But Venezuela was only the opening move. Mexico represents the manufacturing hinge, a country that allows Chinese production networks to reach American consumers without triggering American trade defenses. Panama represents the shipping choke point, control over a canal that still moves a meaningful percentage of global commerce. Canada represents resource security, energy, minerals, agriculture, inputs the American system assumes will always be there when needed. Each pressure point serves a different function. Together, they form a coordinated squeeze, not to punish individual countries, but to reshape the economic architecture of the hemisphere before alternative systems harden beyond reach. Right now, you're being shown the spectacle, the raid, the statements, the flags. Because if you're focused on the spectacle, you're not asking the real question. What happens if this doesn't stop here? To understand why this pressure campaign accelerated now, you have to look at what stopped working. For decades, American influence in the hemisphere didn't need to be enforced. It was embedded. Trade flowed north. Capital flowed south. Infrastructure decisions, financing, and market access all passed through Washington by default. Countries complied not because they were coerced, but because there was no viable alternative that offered the same scale, stability, and access. That assumption is no longer safe. Over the last 20 years, a parallel economic system has been forming across Latin America. It didn't arrive with flags or speeches. It arrived with ports, railways, fiber networks, power grids, and long-term supply contracts. Trade that once moved vertically began moving laterally, south to east instead of south to north. Dollars became optional in transactions that had once required them. This shift wasn't dramatic. It was patient. And patience is dangerous when you're trying to preserve dominance. Venezuela exposed the fault line because it combined three elements Washington could not ignore: massive resource reserves, willingness to transact outside traditional financial channels, and no credible path back into the old system. Sanctions had already removed the incentive to comply. What remained was adaptation. Once adaptation succeeds, even marginally, it becomes precedent. That's why oil denomination mattered more than oil volume. 1 million barrels priced outside the dollar system is not an energy problem, it's a monetary one. It suggests that access to markets no longer requires access to US financial infrastructure. And once that belief spreads, leverage erodes quickly. Mexico complicated the picture further. Unlike Venezuela, Mexico benefits enormously from integration with the United States. But it also became the bridge that allowed Chinese manufacturing networks to bypass American trade restrictions. Components arrived from Asia. Assembly happens on Mexican soil. Finished goods cross the border as North American products. The supply chain is technically compliant, but strategically disruptive. From Washington's perspective, this nullifies the purpose of tariffs. If trade barriers can be routed around through geography and paperwork, then economic pressure stops working. The response was predictable. Pressure Mexico to choose: maintain privileged access to American markets or continue facilitating an alternative system that undermines US leverage. Panama presents a different problem. Choke points don't need to be hostile to be dangerous. They only need to be dependent. The canal doesn't have to be closed to become leverage. Delays, prioritization, coordination with commercial partners. These are subtle tools that matter during periods of tension. Control over infrastructure translates into influence without firing a shot. Canada completes the picture. A partner so integrated, it was assumed to be permanent. Energy, minerals, agriculture, flows calibrated for decades to move south. But even Canada has been diversifying. New export routes, new buyers, new pricing arrangements. From a risk management standpoint, that makes sense. From a strategic standpoint, it introduces uncertainty into systems built on reliability. The common thread is not defiance, it's optionality. Countries are building options. Options reduce dependence. Reduced dependence weakens leverage. And weakened leverage forces escalation if control is to be maintained. This is where pressure replaces persuasion. The mistake is assuming pressure can be applied without consequence. Pressure changes behavior in the short term, but it also changes incentives in the long term. Every threat teaches its target what to protect against next time. What makes this strategy risky isn't that it uses pressure. It's that it relies on pressure as a substitute for attraction. Economic systems hold together when participation feels beneficial. They fracture when participation feels conditional. The moment countries believe access can be revoked without warning, they start planning for life outside the system, not because they want confrontation, but because dependence becomes a liability. That's the paradox now taking shape across the hemisphere. Every application of pressure may secure short-term compliance, but it also accelerates long-term diversification. Venezuela will remember that oil priced outside the dollar made it a target. Mexico will remember that integration came with sovereignty costs. Panama will remember that strategic geography invites external demands. Canada will remember that even the closest partnerships are subject to political leverage. None of these countries need to abandon the United States to change behavior. They only need to hedge. And hedging, once built into infrastructure, trade agreements, and payment systems, doesn't reverse easily. This is why the operation in Venezuela mattered far beyond Caracas. It demonstrated that military force is still on the table as a tool of economic statecraft. That message wasn't just heard by adversaries, it was heard by partners, and partners draw conclusions quietly. The administration may believe it is reasserting control. In the narrow sense, it might be. Pressure works best when alternatives are weak. But alternatives are no longer theoretical. They exist. They're imperfect. They're more expensive. But they're improving. And pressure is the accelerant. There are three paths forward. The first is reintegration. Pressure succeeds. Countries realign economically with Washington, and the hemisphere returns to a US-centered system. But this only works if pressure is paired with better offers. Investment, access, stability that outweighs the appeal of alternatives. Pressure alone cannot rebuild loyalty. The second is fragmentation. Countries resist, coordinate, and deepen alternative systems. Trade blocs harden. Payment systems diverge. Economic competition becomes geopolitical competition. Influence turns zero-sum. The third is accommodation, a managed balance where countries maintain diversified relationships without being forced into binary choices. This path preserves stability, but it requires accepting limits on control. It requires trust, and trust is the one resource that cannot be compelled. Right now, the strategy points toward fragmentation, even if that isn't the intention. The helicopters in Caracas were not the climax. They were the signal that leverage would be enforced, not negotiated. And once that signal is sent, the system adapts around it. Economic power isn't lost all at once. It erodes at the margins, through workarounds, through hedges, through insurance policies built quietly into contracts and infrastructure. By the time the shift becomes visible, it's usually irreversible. Nothing waits forever. Not systems, not dominance, not leverage. The real question isn't whether this strategy works tomorrow. It's what kind of hemisphere it creates 5 years from now, one bound by cooperation or one held together by pressure until the pressure no longer holds. And once that point is reached, no operation, no matter how precise, can put the system back the way it was.